Hello, I'm Li Hao. So today we're going to talk about add HTML. So what is it? Well, we shall take a look. So imagine you have this scenario where you have a HTML string that is dynamically generated, and you want to insert all this HTML string in somewhere in your document, right? In your DOM. So what do? So maybe you can use an action. Well, let's take a look if you want to use an action and how you would do that, right? So here I have a div and a text area that I can edit my HTML. Right, so what I need to do is probably use an action over here, inner HTML, and I'm gonna pass my HTML into this action. Right, so let's define this action. So I can have inner HTML as an action that takes in a node. So the node will be the div that I'm applying this action to, and the HTML, which is the text that I'm gonna pass in over here. Right, so usually what you would do is maybe you want to add all this HTML inside this element, right? So actually your DOM API provides an API called a inner HTML. So you can say node.inner HTML equals to HTML. Right here you see that you get this is a bold text and click me button, right? That's easy, right? So next thing is if you try to update this, return. So you need to return an update method over here. HTML. What you need to do is constantly update the inner HTML of your node. So if I type something, it should update update on demand, right? As you change your text. So you could use this action to achieve what you want to do, but there's an even easier way to do it in Svelte, which is use add HTML. So add HTML actually does all of the above that we have done so far, but using but we've packaged it up in a nice API which is called add HTML. So let's write add HTML, and you can throw all these things away. And here you pass in expressions. So an expressions can be anything that just form a string that you would like to be inserted as an inner HTML in your in the element. So you would say HTML over here, and now we remove this action. See that everything still looks the same, and you don't have to even handle the case where dynamic text, you can change it dynamically, it will update by itself. That's good, right? So sometimes this is good enough for you, but sometimes you have some requirements, right? So sometimes this HTML comes from some API somewhere that you can't control, but itself have some parts of the HTML is interactive, right? So there's two parts over here. So if this HTML is somewhere that you can't control at all, then you kind of have to insert it as add HTML over here, right? Dynamically update it, right? But if it's somewhere that you can control, then my suggestion for you would be copy all this, come over here, create a new component, paste it in, and then just import it, right? Then it's a lot way easier to add interactions to elements over here. For example, adding on click for the button, have some dynamic contents to update the text, things like that, right? But how about your case that you can't control? For example, this text is being typed out over here, and so the text is generated on demand, on the fly, somewhere that you can't really control. Like for example, this is being typed out by the user, and now the tricky part is you want to add interactions to some of the elements. So for example, you want to make all the buttons click to have a kind of like a similar click you want to have a click handler on the buttons, right? So each button probably has some ID. Right over here, I have some ID, XYZ, and when I have a click function, I want to know, for example here, I want to know maybe what's the button's ID, and I can do something with it, right? So here I could have say event.target dot ID, and I just console out, but I can do anything about it, right? The thing is, how do I attach this event listener to this button that we just generated? So this is tricky, right? So when you right now, when you want to do it, you realize that you haven't have the reference to any of the buttons yet. So how do you add event listeners to the button, right? So where you have to add it is you have to add it during on mount. Why? Because before on mount, and only if you do it over here, for example, you come over here and say document.query selector button, and you want to add event listener, you realize that you have error because the button, you can't find the button yet because the button is not yet available for you. So what you have to do is come in here, use onMount, and then run this during onMount. So I can come over here and say onMount and find the buttons and then add event listener, right? That's only when the button is available for you. But in this case, it's a bit tricky. Just select all the buttons on the screen, right? Meaning because you're query selector on the button on the document. So if this is an optional, if for your situation that it's possible for you to find out all the like a container element, then a better way is you have maybe like a div bind this, right? You have a container, reference to a container, and you use that to query all the buttons inside this div, right? So this is slightly safer than doing a document a query selector all, right? You're finding all the buttons within the document, right? So here we only find all the buttons within this div. So hopefully that's only limited to only this HTML buttons over here. So over here I add event listener, and I console log, click, right? Now you see that it works. However, if I'm going to change this now, this most likely will set inner HTML, updates everything over here, replace the HTML text, which then will for the browser, it means to recreate all the elements. Right now, when you click me, nothing happens. So what should you do now? Well, one way that you can do is have a way to run every time when HTML changes, right? And that is to use a reactive statement, right? So you have over here HTML, and then you will do something. Attach button listener. Right, so what this line of code means is that for this is how a reactive statement works, right? So when you look at it, you see two variables over here, HTML and attached button listeners. Whenever either of the variable has changed, then this statement will be rerun, right? In this case, since attach button listener is a function and we never change it, then it's indirectly means that anytime when HTML changes, this whole statement is being re-evaluated. Of course, you can write this way as well. It doesn't. In our case, it doesn't really matter because HTML is kind of always something, right? So if you write this HTML attach button listener, then yeah, you want to do something. However, if you try to come over here and say div query selector, you realize that there's a few errors. First is that div is not yet available because you haven't mount a you will run this, you evaluate this first before you first mounting any elements, right? So reactive statements or reactive declarations will be run even before, like after initializing your component, but before you try to mount the elements. When you're trying to create the elements, all the reactive statements will be run because sometimes you want to declare some reactive variables, right? And you're going to use it in a template. So this has to be run ahead before you actually create an element and mount it on a DOM. So over here, div will be undefined. So what do you do? In this case, I would think that we would either check, like we could check if div is not available, then we return, right? So we over here, if you look at console log, every time when we change something, realize that it will be evaluated. But again, this is going to be evaluated before we're going to update something. So what this means is that if you notice that although I type and I'm going to call this every time, but when you click, nothing happens. Why? Because this runs right before any changes, right? Because you want to, if it's a reactive statements or variables that you're trying to update it, you want the variable to be updated before you actually make changes to them, right? Before you update them and things like that, because you want the variable to be ready first, right? All those reactively declared variables to be updated first before you update the DOM. So over here, when this is being run, you're actually accessing the old content, right? You are finding all the old button and then attach event listeners to them. So this is not what you want. What you want is you want to come over here at tick. You want to wait for a tick before you. Oops. You want to wait for a tick before you actually search for the buttons and then make some changes, right? So now, once the tick is done, actually the div is also being defined because the tick will be resolved. The tick will return a function that will be resolved when update or mounting has done. Right? If you're not sure about how tick works, I have a video about tick. You should check that out. Links in the description and hopefully on somewhere in our screen, right? So we wait for a tick and then we select. So we wait for updates happens and then only you look for buttons and attach event listeners, right? So here, if I click, now you can still see a click me. And I change something and then I click. This will still happens because you will, anytime HTML changes, you'll wait for the changes to be applied. Then only you figure out, you find the newest buttons and then you attach event listeners. So here we always attach event listeners, but we never remove them. So will this be an issue and how do we resolve it? Right, so here, let's try to just use this event listener instead. No big deal. It's just that it's easier to remove this because we can reference to the same function, right? So here, this still works, right? We print out the XYZ of the button. So if you have multiple buttons over here, I can use selector all and then for each button dot add event listener. All right, so here if I create more button, id equals to zzzz, click me to, whoops. What's wrong with this? Okay, so if I click this, you see ZZZ, it clicks this, you see XYZ, right? And every time we change something, everything still works. But we actually haven't removed event listeners for previously selected buttons. So here, what should we do is that we should, as I mentioned here, we kind of know that if we call this is every time when HTML changes, right? So there's two phases. One is before you want to create any elements, right? The first time when the component is mounted, you run this first, and then only you mount the component. And we use a tick to wait for that mounting to be done. Only we select for any elements and updates, attach event listeners. Right? The same thing happens when HTML changes. You call this function, but that's update hasn't been done, right? You call this function, so we wait for a tick, we wait for the changes to be actually applied to the DOM, then we select the newly created buttons and then attach event listeners. So there's always like before the update is done, which is like the prior, right? Which is over here, before things has been updated or before the things has been created. Over here, we can actually find out all the buttons that we have over here and then remove event listeners from them, right? So here, I would need to check if this is being defined first, because there's two cases, right? One is mounting, one is updating, right? When you're mounting, the div is not even existed. You don't even have any buttons that you can query for, right? So if you check if div, only you try to, if it exists, then only you try to remove any event listeners from the buttons, right? Over here, I'm going to copy the code and say button remove event listener, click. All right, so now, although if you take a look at the code, nothing much has changed, but we remember to remove event listeners that we just added to the buttons, right? And that's now we handle the mounting case, handle the updating case. We actually haven't handled one case, which is when we try to unmount the component, right? Over here, when you unmount the component, this will not be called because HTML is not changing. We just want to remove the component, right? So right before that, we still have one last chance to do cleanup, which is during on destroy. So on destroy, we're gonna come over here, on destroy. I'll just uncomment this. On destroy, we're gonna find out all the buttons that we have and remove event listeners. So now when you detach, remove this container, all the buttons has already been cleaned up with all the event listeners. So here you go. Here is how you would have to, if you want to not just adding HTML string as part of your container, you want to add some interactive like add event listeners and do something, you would have to do this dance of wait for the content to be changed before you apply some changes, right? And if you want to add event listeners, remember to remove event listeners when you don't need them anymore. Of course, depends on your design. Sometimes you don't have the luxury of having a div container that wraps your elements, right? In this case, the HTML, you have to write it at the root level. Well, then it's how do you scope this? So this is just about like how do you scope the query selector, right? If you ask me, I would say that every time when you want to apply, like when you have something like this and you know that you want to find out all the buttons, probably you can add some hints to the HTML, right? So for example, over here, I can say, because this is a string, right? So I can come over here and replace all. I can replace all button text. Okay, shit. So the thing about here is, okay, I think it's just a syntax highlighting. I can replace all button text with button and maybe add some data attribute that I can query for. So special. Okay. Li Hao. Right, so I replace all this button to be button data special Li Hao. So what does that mean? If you inspect element over here, you realize that this line of buttons that I created all have this special attribute called data special my name, right? So here you don't have it, here you have it. So this is because HTML is just a string, right? You can replace string, you can make some manipulation before you insert HTML into the DOM, right? So here you kind of have some way to scope out all the buttons that you only created in this component. So maybe this is a string that not just Li Hao, maybe dynamically generated ID that attached to this component. And now what you do, instead of div that query selector all, you come over here and say document.query selector all button with this special attribute data special equals Lihao. And then for each of them, you attach event listener. Right. And now if you try to click this, yeah, so I think it's just like the hot reloading something messed up just now. So now if I try to click me, you see that this works, and we only scope out to the buttons that has this special attribute called Lihao, my name, right? So any buttons outside will not be selected, right? So you can remember this is just you can pass in any string, and even if it's a dynamically generated string that provides to you, you can still manipulate the string, replace like the button to add some special attribute, things like that. Of course, this does not handle some edge cases where maybe this is part of your text that you don't want to be transformed. This is some button that you want to replace. You want more sophisticated things, then you have to have some more sophisticated way of doing the replace all, right? But this is just a way to, this is a very simple case to demonstrate for you that you can do a simple replace all to scope out the button that is only created via this HTML, and then only attach event listeners to them, right? Only add interactions, right? So you don't affect other buttons outside. But if you're lucky enough that you have a container, then I think the easier way is to just query selector from the container itself, so only find out all the elements. But if you're unlucky enough to have maybe like other buttons over here, then yeah, maybe you would have to do this to only limits button that is created only from this HTML. So that's all for this video. If you have any questions, feel free to comment down below. If you like this video, learn something, want to share to a friend, share it, do it, like it, share to a friend. So as always, subscribe to my channel so that you get notified when the next video is out. So see ya, bye bye.